Mr. Poilievre, welcome.
Thank you.
You're in a different room again. I'm going to invite you to PEI where you have to stay in the same room for 14 days. Go ahead.
I think you'd like to lock me up and throw away the key, Mr. Chair.
Not me.
Yes. Dr. Di Matteo, you're one of Canada's leading fiscal historians. The Bank of Canada has expanded its balance sheet by $400 billion, 400%. Has this ever happened before?
That's a very good question. I guess my first answer is I actually don't do monetary economic history, but the size of the increase is certainly outside of my living memory and my recollection of similar types of events, even during times of increases in public spending. I mean, the last time there was a major ramp up of this nature during World War II, for example, most of it was standard deficit financing in terms of victory bonds and actual purchases, as opposed to sort of money creation and monetization.
So even defending Western civilization against Hitler and Mussolini, our government actually raised its money by borrowing real dollars from real people rather than credit creation at the central bank.
Well, at that time, that was the approach that they used. I mean, World War II, the debt was contracted at, I guess, what you would term patriotically low interest rates, given that it was the fight to save democracy. And so that, in a sense, assisted the process of borrowing because the rates were quite low at that time.
Your research shows that the biggest deficits as a share of GDP in Canadian history happened in the mid part of the war. And those are the only deficits as a share of the economy that are bigger than those today. But your research also demonstrates that in 1946 and 47, we ran the biggest surpluses as a share of GDP in Canadian history, rapidly paying back that debt. Do you see the current government on track to doing that after this crisis is over?
Well, that's a function of two things. So the rapid pay down was first. There was a large demobilization after the war effort. And so expenditures, of course, came down very quickly. There was also, in the immediate period right after the war, essentially a very large economic boom. I mean, the demographic factors of the time, there was the baby boom, there was a natural resource boom with natural resource exports. And so the growth rate of the economy moving into the end of the 1940s and into the 1950s saw economic growth in real terms annually easily in the 4 to 5, 6% range some years.
Do you see that kind of growth repeating itself to pay for all of this new spending?
Well, you know, you're asking me to conduct a forecast, and I don't really want to make weather forecasters look good. So I mean, essentially, the factors for that type of rebound don't seem to be there.
Right.
However, the one thing I would offer is that in the wake of the pandemic, if you want to think about sort of human psychology, there might be a lot of consumer spending to make up for lost time, given the restrictions that have been faced. But again, I don't see the signs there.
Consumer spending is interesting. It increases demand, but in the absence of supply, in fact, with a possible supply reduction that has occurred over the last year, while supply chains have been downed, there could be a faster growth in consumption than there is in production. We know that historically has led to inflation. None of the experts believe that's going to happen, but the experts are often wrong. In 1978, there was both high unemployment and high inflation at the same time, leading interest rates to move from 8% to 22% in 24 months, with no prediction of that from the experts, and without the Bank of Canada ever anticipating it. Is it possible that interest rates could rise faster than all of the experts are predicting, based on your knowledge of history?
Well, let me answer that two ways. Unpredicted changes can happen. No one predicted the pandemic and its effect on the economy. And the other thing you have to keep in mind is that what's happened over the last 20 years, inflation has been low. And part of that has to do with internationally integrated supply chains. Basically, the aggregate supply curve, if you want to think of that, has stayed flat in response to demand. But there's been disruption to that process. There's been a lot more protectionism. So if that aggregate supply curve, because of all these disruptions in productions internationally, starts to go upward, at some point with increased demand, prices will go up. And once prices start to go up, you're going to have to see a response in terms of interest rates if there seems to be any possibility of inflation taking off.